Hi there. Today I want to talk about Russia's political economy, and as is so often the case with Russia, we're going to start with a little bit of somewhat recent history because you really can't understand Russia's particular variety of capitalism today without understanding the really rapid and precipitous and in many ways destabilizing transition from the Soviet planned economy. So after the Soviet Union falls apart in 1991, as you recall, Boris Yeltsin becomes the president, and his economic policy is known as shock therapy. A reminder that part of the reason why the USSR falls apart in the first place is that it's undergoing economic stagnation in the 1970s and 1980s. Under Mikhail Gorbachev, there are some attempts at reform incrementally within the system. That doesn't work. That just unleashes more tensions, helps contribute to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so rapid reform is really a major priority for Yeltsin. And so he implements, with the help of a variety of academics and consultants, this program called shock therapy, which basically means ripping off the band-aid of the planned economy. So central planning, this idea that the government is going to set targets for economic production and dictate who makes what where, just goes away. Price controls on how much businesses can charge for stuff just go away. And the result of that is initially just chaos. Russia undergoes a period of hyperinflation, meaning that money is losing its value. In 1992, the inflation rate is 2,000%, which is really not good. The economy goes into recession and will stay there for much of the 1990s. And one effect of this is serious political tensions. You'll recall, I hope, that Yeltsin actually engages in this massive showdown to the point of actually having the army shell the parliament building with his own legislature. And a major part of the reason for that is that a lot of members of the legislature are not on board with Yeltsin's programs of economic reforms, and Yeltsin wants to clear them out of the way in order to be able to push through this liberalization program. So a lot of Russian political elites will be significantly alienated from Yeltsin as a result of the shock therapy program. A lot of ordinary Russian people will experience a great deal of just sort of personal insecurity and scarcity as a result of shock therapy. And it's going to have lasting impacts, as you can probably tell when you think about political competition. It's going to have lasting impacts on the way that some people have formed their political ideology and their political behavior in Russia, even today. Shock therapy, despite the initial instability, is going to continue throughout the Yeltsin administration, and he's going to push forward later in the 1990s with privatizing all these state-owned businesses. His goal is to transfer these businesses from the hands of the state into the hands of ordinary Russians. And the way that he chooses to do that is by having the state distribute vouchers, which are basically little coupons that entitle you to purchase shares in state-owned companies. The idea here is to give as many ordinary people as possible a stake in Russia's new capitalist economy, to distribute the proceeds of these state-owned industries as broadly as possible around the country. But that's not how it happens. Most citizens don't use their vouchers, among other things. They have more immediate financial needs, and instead they sell them at a discount to a small number of people who can afford to pay cash for these vouchers and who have the foresight to realize, hey, if I accumulate enough stock in these privatized companies, there could be a whole lot of money in it for me. And in particular, ironically, a number of the people who had been directors of these companies under the Soviet system, who had been relatively well connected under the communist system, will manage to retain their control and retain their influence and retain their privileged position in Russia's economy and society by taking advantage of this rapid privatization, which is somewhat disorganized. Fast forward to 1996, there are still some companies that are held by the Russian state, and the Russian state finds itself needing access to cash. It needs to go out and seek loans. And it contrives to get these loans from Russian banks, from some of these newly minted oligarchs, in order by offering them collateral. And the collateral that the state can offer is shares in some of these companies that haven't been privatized. This is known as the loans for shares scheme. So the effect of this is that it allows these banks, which are newly privatized, to gain controlling shares in what remains of Russia's state-owned industries, in particular in the natural resources and in the energy sectors, which, as we're going to see later in this lecture, are super important in the Russian economy overall. The shares are undervalued. The government hands them out more cheaply than they probably could have sold them on the open market. The government also sets rules that makes it difficult for foreign investors to buy into these newly privatized companies. And so the result is that a fairly small number of people who are already politically connected are going to be able to benefit tremendously from Russia's liberalization and privatization. This is known as insider privatization, meaning that people who have the most political connections are going to benefit from the most and are going to end up having a really significant share of this new Russian economy. The result of this is the formation of a new economic elite. And there's basically two groups of people who benefit in the short term or in the medium term from Yeltsin's reforms. The first group of people is known as the nomenklatura, and that's people who had already been in a privileged position in the Soviet system, often members of the Communist Party, often people who had reached high-ranking positions in the Soviet governments. And so some of these people will manage to manipulate privatization and manipulate liberalization in a way that allows them to retain power, sometimes in the industries that they had worked in the communist system. But the other group of people are new elites who become known as oligarchs. These are entrepreneurs, many of them who had not enjoyed access to power within the communist system, who managed to capitalize on privatization. So they'll start up a variety of small businesses. Some of them will succeed and manage to turn those early profits into controlling stakes in these newly privatized companies. A result of these reforms, whether you're talking about the nomenclatura or these newly minted oligarchs, is that the system is going to be pretty deeply corrupt. As we've already seen, connections to Yeltsin's inner circle, connections to the existing power structure are going to make it much easier for this select group of people to gain access to what had previously been the resources of the state. A necessary corollary of that is inequality. Russia's privatization is going to benefit a pretty small group of people tremendously, but those benefits are not going to be shared out across the country. The other thing you need to note, and that's going to be important when we get to the rise of Vladimir Putin, is that these new oligarchs are also going to have a lot of political power. They are deeply enmeshed with Yeltsin. He needs their cooperation. In some cases, he needs their loans from the banks that they control in order to keep his government running, in order to get reelected in 1996. And so there's an increasing perception in the 1990s that the people who control Russia's economic assets are also the people who are really have their hands on the levers of political power in the country. Fast forward to 2000, Vladimir Putin becomes president, and he's actually going to see the oligarchs as a threat. They are closely associated with Yeltsin, his predecessor, but he is really going to make some determined moves to crack down on the power of the oligarchs, and in general, that's going to mean going after their money. The most famous, the most prominent example of this is a guy named Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who at the time of his downfall in 2003 is the richest individual in Russia. Khodorkovsky gets rich during perestroika, so in the 80s, even before the fall of the Soviet Union, when the Gorbachev government is making these tentative steps towards economic reforms. And then he really makes out like a bandit in the 1990s by gaining control over a newly privatized oil company called Yukos. His mistake from using the benefits of hindsight, his mistake is to start getting increasingly involved in politics. And he's not overtly criticizing Putin, but he is kind of flexing his political muscles in a way that makes Putin think Khodorkovsky is potentially going to be a threat for power somewhere down the line. And so in 2003, in keeping with that rule by law, that use of the judiciary for political purposes that we've talked about elsewhere in our discussions about Russia, in 2003, Khodorkovsky is arrested. He is charged with tax evasion. He's convicted, he's sentenced to prison, and he's held in prison for 10 years. In 2013, Putin pardons him, which is kind of a surprise move. But Khodorkovsky immediately leaves the country, moves to Switzerland, says he's taking care of his ailing mother, and has been increasingly critical of Putin's regime, but from outside the country. Other oligarchs, although less high profile, will similarly see their assets seized, and a lot of those assets will be either renationalized, transferred back to the state, or transferred to a different elite that's going to gain power under Putin. That group of people is known as the Siloviki. These are powerful people who usually have backgrounds in the security services, in the FSB, in the military, who have a professional background more similar to that of Vladimir Putin, who also comes up through the FSB, the successor to the KGB. And so this is the new economic elite. I don't think it's accurate to say that under Putin, assets have been seized from the oligarchs and redistributed to the people. Instead, what we've seen is the demise of an old elite and the rise of a new elite that's personally connected to Putin and that owes him for their access to resources and vast wealth. So some of these assets get transferred to the Siloviki in order to bring up this new elite that's really going to owe their status to Putin. Others are going to be renationalized. And in particular, Putin is going to renationalize assets in the oil and gas sector, elsewhere in mineral extraction, and also in the media. All of this, I think, if we are going to permit ourselves to apply a normative spin for a moment, sounds pretty bad. But one thing that you can say is that under Putin, Russia returns to economic growth. And let me show you that in a chart, which is faster than me just talking about it. This graph shows you GDP per capita in Russia from 1990 through 2020. And so what you can see is a pretty precipitous decline in Russia's economy during the 1990s, during the Yeltsin years. And then late 1990s, it's going to start picking up, and that will coincide with the rise of Vladimir Putin with his first 2 terms as president. So we see steady growth during Putin's first government, but then since 2008, with the global financial crisis, that growth has really slowed down, and Russia has endured some periods of economic decline and a longer period of economic stagnation. And I'm going to argue that the reason why Russia's economy has not been able to sustain that growth that it first found under Putin is your old friend, the resource curse, or the resource trap, depending whom you ask. You might know, it's worth noting that a lot of that kind of steady rise in Russia's economy, that steady economic growth in the 2000s, coincides with a rise in global oil prices. And oil and gas are important sources of economic activity for Russia's economy as a whole, and particularly sources of revenue for its governments. So oil and gas account for about 60% of the export revenue of Russia, its foreign currency earnings, about 30% of Russia's gross domestic product, so its economic activity as a whole. And then depending on what the oil price is, somewhere between a third and half of budget revenue. The numbers fluctuate a lot from year to year as oil prices change. So why do we care? And this should sound familiar because you've thought in my class about the resource curse before. Number one, a number of those oil and gas companies are controlled either directly by the state or by Putin's allies, the Siloviki, these people with security backgrounds who are personally close to Putin. And so there are increasing concerns about corruption, right? About people needing to have access to Putin in order to get access to these state resources. There's also a number of companies in Russia's particularly resource economy where ownership is just really shady. It's actually really difficult to determine who is controlling these companies and who is benefiting from them. There's not a huge amount of transparency in that regard. The widespread perception of corruption actually is an inhibition to investments in Russia's economy, both for foreign investors who distrust that Russia will be able to deliver the rule of law, and for domestic investors. So there's some significant flight of capital out of the country, and also some degree of flight of particularly educated people who basically say, I have kind of talent and skills. I might even have some wealth to invest, but I don't have the political connections that are going to enable me to make my money in this country, and so I'm going to leave Russia and go somewhere else. We tend to see that in countries with high levels of corruption perceptions. Problem number 3 is that Putin's popularity to a considerable degree depends on Russia's economic growth, on Russia's economic situation. That's not unique to Putin. That's true of most leaders in most countries. People care about, their daily economic situation. But a problem for Putin is that it's all well and good when oil prices are rising and the government can spend money and people feel like their lives are getting better. But when the oil price crashes, which is largely beyond the Russian state's control, Putin needs to do something else in order to protect his popularity. And in particular, at 2 moments where Russia's economy has gone south, we've seen Putin launch kind of small, very winnable foreign wars, potentially in an attempt to shore up his popularity. So in 2008, Russia's economy tanks in the global financial crisis. Putin instigates a war in Georgia in the Caucasus. Then in 2014, again facing economic stagnation, Putin instigates a war in Ukraine, which we'll talk about later in this class. I think it's probably too simplistic to say the economy went south, so Putin started a war. You can't read his mind. You can't guarantee that that's his motivation. But it is worth noting that there's this correlation, and that both of those military engagements, at least temporarily, seem to have shored up Putin's approval rating. I will leave it there. We will have yet more to say about the resource curse when I see you in class. Thanks.